When Donald Trump and Xi Jinping met in Beijing in May 2026, most of the attention went straight to the obvious headlines. China would buy more American farm products. Boeing was suddenly back in the conversation, and both sides tried to frame the meeting as a meaningful reset. But the bigger question isn't just what Washington and Beijing agreed to. It's who else benefits when the world's two largest economies decide to lower the temperature, even slightly. Because a deal like this doesn't stay inside the room. It reaches soybean farms in the American Midwest, chip plants in South Korea, auto factories in Japan, ports in Singapore, electronics hubs in Malaysia, and export-driven economies across Southeast Asia. According to Reuters, China said it would buy at least $17 billion in U.S. agricultural products every year from 2026 through 2028. That matters after American farm exports to China fell by more than 65% in 2025 to about $8.4 billion. The White House also said China would purchase 200 Boeing aircraft, though Beijing described parts of the outcome as preliminary. So this isn't a finished peace deal. Still, the IMF said lower U.S.-China tensions are good for the world economy, and that brings us to the 10 countries that stand to benefit the most. Number 10. Australia wasn't in the room, and it wasn't the country negotiating the farm purchases after the Trump-Sex meeting. Even so, it belongs here because when China steadies, Australia feels it fast. Recent trade data showed Australian exports to China at more than $100 billion in 2025, keeping that relationship central to Australia's export economy. And it goes well beyond iron ore and coal. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, China was Australia's largest services export market in 2025, worth nearly 19.7 billion Australian dollars, up more than 16% from the year. Before that includes education, travel, professional services, and businesses that benefit when Chinese spending holds up. So if the US-China standoff cools, Canberra notices. If Chinese factories worry less about tariff shocks, if confidence inside China steadies, and if trade routes feel less jumpy, Australian exporters can plan better. Mining firms notice that, but so do universities, tourism operators, and logistics companies. Australia's position is still complicated. It has also benefited from Western efforts to rely less on China, especially in key minerals. In 2026, Australia moved closer to Europe on trade and mineral supply, partly because other governments wanted alternatives to Chinese dominance in high-tech materials. So if US-China tensions soften too much, some urgency could fade. Australia gains from a healthier Chinese economy, but also from a world still building backup plans. Its upside here is steadier demand, easier planning, and less uncertainty for industries tied to China's economic pulse. In a trade climate where policy can change with one press conference, that calm is worth real money. Thailand enters from a different angle. Its exposure is more immediate because it sits inside Asia's manufacturing network, where even a small shift in trade tension can affect orders, factory schedules, and export confidence. Number 9. Thailand may not be the first country people think of when they hear Trump and Xi reached a deal. But it has become far more important to global manufacturing than it often gets credit for. U.S. trade data showed total goods trade between the United States and Thailand reached about $110.8 billion in 2025. American imports from Thailand alone climbed to roughly $91.3 billion, up more than 44% from the year before. That shows Thailand has become a much more serious supplier to the U.S. market. A lot of that growth sits in electronics, machinery, and technology-related exports. Reuters reported that Thai exports rose nearly 18% in the first quarter of 2026, helped by electronics and products tied to the global AI hardware boom. The country is now deeply plugged into the factory networks behind modern manufacturing. Thailand benefits when business shifts away from China and into Southeast Asia. But it also benefits when China remains a dependable source of parts and materials factories need. Thai manufacturers often rely on Chinese inputs to produce goods that later move into markets like the United States. If US-China tensions worsen, costs rise, delays build, and companies in the middle get squeezed. If tensions ease even a little, exporters can plan with more confidence, factories can place orders with less fear, and shipping gets easier to price. That matters because exports are helping carry the economy, while tourism and spending at home haven't been as reliable. Thailand probably doesn't want the rivalry to disappear overnight. Some of its recent gains came from companies trying not to rely too heavily on China. It may create a quick opening, yet it makes long-term growth harder to manage. Thailand lands here because a clearer trade climate helps the industries carrying much of its export growth, even if some of that growth came from disorder. Vietnam pushes that contradiction even further. Number 8. Vietnam. Few countries outside China have benefited more visibly from companies moving parts of production elsewhere. According to the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, total goods trade between the United States and Vietnam reached about $209.5 billion in 2025. American imports from Vietnam alone hit roughly $193.8 billion, up 42% in a single year. Vietnam is no longer just an emerging export story. It has become central to how American companies source manufactured goods. Electronics, computers, network equipment, furniture, garments, household products, and consumer goods move through it. Many factories also depend on Chinese materials, machinery, or parts upstream. A calmer U.S.-China relationship lowers the chance of sudden tariff shocks, makes planning easier, and gives producers in Bac Ninh, Haiphong, Bac Giang, Binh Duong, and Dong Nai less uncertainty. But Vietnam has also gained from the urgency to diversify away from China. That pressure-filled industrial parks encouraged companies to split production and turned Vietnam into one of the clearest symbols of the China Plus One strategy. So if Washington and Beijing move into a longer phase of warmer trade relations, some of that urgency may fade. It probably won't disappear, but it may lose intensity. Vietnam benefits from stability, yet it has already benefited enormously from disruption. McKinsey has described Southeast Asia as a region that increasingly imports intermediate goods from China and exports finished products to the United States. Vietnam fits that pattern almost perfectly. It sits inside the world's most important trade rivalry, so a meeting in Beijing can affect jobs, factory plans, and export strategies across the country. Vietnam belongs here because its industrial rise is tied to how well America and China manage their competition. Malaysia faces that same rivalry too, but inside a more sensitive part of the global economy. Number 7. Malaysia. Once the conversation turns to semiconductors, electronics, packaging, testing, and precision components, Malaysia stops being background noise. Malaysia's trade agencies said electronics and electrical products remained one of the main engines of export growth through 2025, helped by demand linked to semiconductors and the wider AI investment cycle. Reuters also noted that Malaysia's economy in early 2026 continued to benefit from stronger exports as the global chip cycle improved. Malaysia doesn't simply ship finished gadgets. It helps package, test, assemble, and move components that keep the digital economy running. That puts the country inside the pressure zone between Washington and Beijing. In 2025, Reuters reported that Malaysia was considering tighter semiconductor rules under U.S. pressure, as American officials worried that advanced chips could reach China through third countries. If U.S.-China dialogue improves, Malaysia benefits in two ways. Trade gets less nervous, and Kuala Lumpur may face less pressure from being treated like a possible backdoor in the tech fight between Washington and Beijing. The underlying tension won't disappear. The United States will still care about high-end chip flows, China will still want advanced technology, and Malaysia will still have to walk carefully between them. But a lower temperature relationship makes that balancing act easier. Think about engineers in Penang, plant managers working around tight schedules, and logistics firms that don't want customs rules changing faster than their systems can handle. Malaysia's benefit is less about replacing China outright, and more about keeping a sensitive high-tech pipeline functioning without constant swings. When chip policy becomes less volatile, Malaysia gets more space to make long-term bets instead of treating every investment decision like a political risk. Singapore comes next from almost the opposite direction. Number 6. Singapore. Singapore is one of the few countries that can benefit from both disorder and order. When trade gets messy, companies need help rerouting shipments, storing inventory, finding financing, and managing risk, and Singapore earns money from that work. When trade gets smoother, companies expand, investment rises, and regional commerce accelerates. Enterprise Singapore reported that the country's total merchandise trade rose 8.5% in the third quarter of 2025. Its 2026 trade outlook also reflected stronger growth expectations across China, the United States, the Euro area, and ASEAN economies. More trade usually means more financing, more legal work, more logistics activity, and more companies using the city-state to manage their Asia business. A calmer U.S.-China relationship helps Singapore's banks, shipping firms, regional headquarters, trade lawyers, insurers, and logistics companies. These industries do better when businesses feel confident enough to make decisions beyond the next quarter. If a Japanese manufacturer expands sourcing in Southeast Asia, a Singapore office may help finance it. If a Chinese company wants a new regional structure, Singapore often becomes part of that conversation. And if an American multinational wants to diversify without abandoning Asia, Singapore is usually somewhere inside the planning process. But Singapore doesn't need chaos to matter. What it really needs is steady commercial activity moving through the region. Lower U.S.-China tensions support more of that, which means more cargo through ports, more financial services, more money flowing into projects across the region, more business travel, and more companies using Singapore to make Asia's complexity manageable. Singapore doesn't depend on one narrow benefit from the agreement. It benefits when companies feel more willing to decide instead of waiting out the next geopolitical scare. South Korea gains in a different way. Number 5, South Korea. South Korea can't afford to treat the U.S.-China relationship like somebody else's problem. Samsung, SK Hynix, Hyundai, and LG Energy Solutions sell into global markets, depend on technology rules, and stay deeply exposed to both the American and Chinese economies, according to U.S. trade data. Total goods trade between the United States and South Korea reached about $194 billion in 2025. American exports to South Korea were roughly $68.8 billion, while imports from South Korea reached about $125.2 billion. South Korea also remains heavily connected to China through supply chains, component flows, and buyers there. So when Washington and Beijing fight, Seoul gets dragged into decisions that become harder and more expensive. Companies have to think about where to build, what can be sold into which markets, how much risk they can carry in China, and how fast they should shift investment toward the United States. The Trump's easing doesn't solve all of that. The tech fight's still there. The chip competition is still there, and national security concerns don't vanish because one meeting goes better than expected. But lower tension gives South Korean firms more room to plan, ship, and decide without every trade move feeling like the start of another crisis. Restrictions on key minerals have also worried manufacturers across high-tech manufacturing countries. South Korea's battery makers, electronics firms, and auto producers understand the danger of relying too heavily on uncertain inputs. If the Trump's understanding helps reduce pressure there, even partly, South Korea has a lot to gain. South Korea belongs at number 5 because it is highly exposed and deeply invested in both sides of the global power struggle. When America and China argue less, South Korea gets more space to operate without every strategic choice becoming a diplomatic headache. Germany knows that feeling from another angle. Number 4. Germany. Germany may be one of the biggest indirect winners from any real cooling of U.S.-China tensions because it is deeply tied to both markets at once. Germany sells high-end industrial goods around the world, imports heavily from China, exports heavily to the United States, and feels the strain when those powers clash. According to Germany's Federal Statistics Office, China returned as Germany's top trading partner in 2025. The United States ranked second, with goods trade between Germany and America reaching about 240.5 billion euros. Reuters reported that after China tightened controls on certain rare earth exports, German buyers saw severe disruptions, including moments when critical shipments nearly disappeared. Rare earth and specialty inputs matter for electric motors, robotics, advanced equipment, and defense-linked production. A calmer U.S.-China trade climate could ease some of that pressure, even though it won't erase the underlying risks. Germany will still want to reduce overdependence on China, and the European Union will still push for stronger backup supply chains. But if trade conflict between the two largest economies becomes less aggressive, German companies gain time, flexibility, and fewer unexpected shocks. That helps the Mittelstand manufacturer producing specialized machinery. It helps the auto supplier balancing customers in Europe, China, and North America. It spent years building deep dependencies on China because the profits were attractive, and now it is dealing with the consequences. Still, Germany stands to benefit strongly if the US-China temperature drops. The less unstable global trade becomes, the easier it is for German industry to make longer-term decisions. Japan faces many of the same pressures, but its vulnerability around strategic materials has become even more visible. Number 3. Japan earns the number 3 spot because it stands to benefit clearly from lower US-China friction. It ranks this high because it has already felt the strain of China's rare earth restrictions in a very direct way. Reuters reported that Japan received only about 4% of its previous dysprosium import volume after China tightened controls on key rare earth exports. That is an astonishing drop. Dysprosium matters for high-performance magnets used in electric vehicles, robotics, motors, and advanced manufacturing. It touches industries Japan takes seriously, from Toyota and industrial robotics firms to electronics makers, defense planners, and advanced manufacturers. Any sign that China may ease pressure or avoid deepening disruption matters in Japan. If the broader relationship stabilizes, and if rare earth discussions become part of a less hostile trade climate, Japan could gain serious relief. It wouldn't mean independence from supply risk, and it wouldn't be a permanent fix. Partial relief has value. Japan has already been moving to protect itself. In March 2026, Reuters reported that Japan and France reached an agreement tied to cooperation on rare earth supplies. Tokyo is already trying to build alternatives. Still, alternatives take time, and companies can't pause production while policy catches up. Factories need reliable access to inputs, automakers need supply certainty, and engineers designing future production schedules can't build serious plans around the hope that key minerals arrive on time. That is why any real de-escalation matters for Japan. Its gain isn't abstract. It touches production lines, how the country protects and supports key industries, and the daily ability of companies to make decisions without preparing for another supply shock. If US-China tensions cool, Japan gets meaningful breathing room in industries that matter to its future. China, meanwhile, benefits in an even more strategic way. Number 2. China, after all, China is the side promising to buy more American farm goods. It is also the side discussing purchases that may include 200 Boeing aircraft, according to the White House. China may be paying for a more stable relationship with Washington, and right now that matters. The agreement included plans for a new US-China Board of Trade and a Board of Investment. These channels could help both sides manage disputes before every disagreement becomes another escalation. Its exporters don't benefit from tariff uncertainty, its manufacturers don't benefit from sudden changes in access to Western markets, and its investors don't benefit from a U.S. relationship that keeps swinging between negotiation and confrontation. If buying more American agriculture helps soften that environment, China may see it as a useful price to pay. According to Reuters, China had already reduced its dependence on American soybeans over the past decade. The U.S. share of China's soybean imports fell from about 41% in 2016 to about 8% in 2024. That shows China isn't simply returning to U.S. agriculture because it ran out of alternatives. The decision looks more like a calculated choice than an emergency. Reuters reported that Beijing described the announced deals as preliminary. That gives China more space to negotiate without being boxed in by Washington's version of events. China also gains if it avoids pushing U.S. allies to speed up efforts to rely less on Chinese supply chains. The more aggressively Beijing uses rare earths and key minerals as leverage, the more Japan, Germany, Australia, and EU members look for alternatives. So China gives something now in order to protect a wider position later. It gains time, a less hostile atmosphere, and new channels to bargain before tensions outrun diplomacy. The number 1 spot still belongs to the country with the clearest and easiest to measure upside from this deal. Number 1. United States. The United States takes number 1 because it gets the clearest immediate benefits. According to Reuters, China agreed to buy at least $17 billion in U.S. agricultural products every year from 2026 through 2028. That is a major commitment after American farm exports to China collapsed by more than 65% in 2025 to roughly $8.4 billion. So this isn't a small sales bump. It is an attempt to repair a badly damaged relationship in one of America's most politically sensitive sectors. Farmers have a clear reason to watch what happens next, from corn and soybean growers to sorghum exporters, cattle ranchers, and poultry companies. China also agreed to work on reopening access for certain U.S. beef and poultry shipments from areas no longer affected by bird flu. If a foreign market reopens, exporters can move more product, and rural communities pay attention because the effects don't stop at the farm gate. Then there is Boeing. The White House said China would buy 200 aircraft. Beijing didn't confirm every part of that publicly with the same level of detail, so we shouldn't oversell it as a done deal. A purchase of that size would reach far beyond one company, touching aircraft manufacturing, engines, suppliers, aerospace workers, and the broader industrial base. Reuters later reported that Chinese aviation regulators met with Boeing and GE executives after the summit, giving that part of the story weight even if clarity is still needed. The United States ranks first because the benefits line up across agriculture, livestock, aerospace, and diplomacy. The deal gives Washington something tangible to show, exporters a possible rebound, and farm country a reason to watch what happens next. The real test is whether China buys at the promised scale, whether access changes happen smoothly, and whether Boeing becomes a signed order. Based on what's announced, no country has more to gain directly than the United States. So that's the bigger picture. The Trump-Xi deal doesn't just matter for Washington and Beijing. It also affects farmers, factories, exporters, and major industries across Asia, Europe, and beyond. Some countries gain through direct sales. Others benefit from a little more stability in trade, supply chains, and investment decisions. Of course, a lot still depends on whether these promises actually hold. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this video gave you a clearer view of who really stands to benefit from this agreement. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.